Good evening, everyone. As you don't know, me, I'm Paul Quinn, and I'm currently the director of the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales and Fictions. And I'm delighted to welcome such a large crowd to our first event of the term. And I'm even more delighted to welcome back Jeremy Harte, who's here to speak this evening on medieval fairies. Jeremy is inspired by landscape and the otherworldly. His book Explore Fairy Traditions won the Briggs Award, which is followed by Cloven Country. We're over here available to buy, and there's a special offer form there, so you can take advantage of the large list of excellent University Press. Jeremy serves on the Council of the Folklore Society, organising their legendary weekends, and he's the curator of Bourne Museum in Surrey. Jeremy's previous lecture for us, Subversive or What? Fairy Tradition rather than Social Order, can be found on the Fantasy Centre's YouTube channel, along with 15 years worth of videos. And Jeremy's previous articles for Grammary, Prisoners of the Gods, A Fairy or Else an Insect, From Ogre to Woodlouse, and Subversive or What are all available. To contact you, they're available, Heather?
Yeah, they are probably mostly also open access.
So some of them are open access. One of them definitely won't be, but the other three are open access. So you can have a look on the centre's pages to find those. And so I will hand over to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a crowd at the shrine of St Margaret of Dunfermline. There's always a crowd at the shrine of St Margaret of Dunfermline, because the Blessed Queen Margaret is known to be one of those people who can break open the barriers between the powers of heaven and the illnesses of earth, and she is a good person to go to for healing. Maniacs, cripples, the blind, the visually impaired, I should have said, but this is the 13th century, are all there hoping to be touched by somebody who is able, with her own otherworldly nature, to undo what turn out to be the interventions of the otherworld in people's lives. And there's a big shout at the far end up by the altar where you curl up and go to sleep, hoping to get a beneficial dream, and he's shouting, "I'm cured!" And they say to him, "Yeah, but who are you?" "I'm the dumb guy." Okay, so it's a miracle. Mutinous, for so he appears in the Miracular. And the beautiful thing about miracles is that, you have to respond to the benevolence of sacred power by writing down at least a selection of what's going on. It also kind of fits into an advertising module. If you're in Canterbury, you actually get to see what happened in the stained glass windows, so you know there's a chance of being healed. Other people have been, and you can be too. Luckily, St Margaret of Dunfermline and the sister cult of St Abra of Coldingham both have an interest in asking people their stories. Basically, okay, so you can see, you can walk, you can talk. How did it get like that? And Mutinous is standing there with a big crowd around him, sitting on the steps and going, "Well, I must be nearly 35 now, and I've been here at the shrine for years and years, just doing a couple of odd jobs, lovely of them to look after me. And it all started when I was 5. Ooh, do tell us, because I went out into the fields. I was only a kid, and they sent me out to look after the sheep, and I went out and, like an idiot, I fell asleep out in the fields at midday." And there's a collective scary. And I'm sleeping there and I have a dream. And these 3 ladies come up to me, beautiful ladies. And they look at me. One of them says to the other, "Shall we kill him?" And the third one kind of goes, "He's kind of cute. We'll just condemn him to perpetual silence." She picks an apple up, lobs it into his mouth. He feels it like, "Oh!" And when he wakes up, he can't talk. And for 35 years, he is a suppliant at the shrine, waiting for the healing, which he knows will come. And once I found this sort of material, I realised I was on the trail of something that had not perhaps been brought so much to the forefront. There is a huge body of evidence in medieval Miracular of people whose illnesses, when they actually got the chance to explain it, and the northern miracles are unusual. Normally, the custom was simply to make sure that people reported having been ill, which was fine, and having got better, which was a miracle. You didn't ask. These people asked, and all the stories came tumbling out. There's a little girl who's out, running out just into the orchard, not even going out into the wilderness or anything. And she sees a little boy, about her age, but black all over, running around the trees, and it's like, hey, shall we play together? And she's like, I don't think I know you. Wrong move. As soon as she doesn't kind of join in the game, he touches her, and she falls down in a swoon. And then after that, she's crippled. Can't use her hands or feet. Clumps her way on those little wooden stools that people used to use to the shrine. And many years later, she recovers the use of her limbs. These beings, and of course the question as to what kind of beings we're engaging with, is left very empty by the texts. They don't bother even to say demon. Sometimes they'll flag it up, but by and large, it's just a stranger. And of course, with any medieval source, if I could get out there and do field work, I'd be hearing the people's stories directly. This material is like second-hand reportage. It's as close as we're going to get to what it was like to encounter one of the other crowd. And of course, always an adverse report. These are the people who inflicted disease. Only very, very rarely do I get to hear about the people who can cure as well as harm, who do the work of both saint and fairy in one. Agnes Clark was living in Suffolk, ordinary, grown up, but friendly with a people who she refers to as the elves. And she hung around with them like teenagers do, and, they kind of accepted her, obviously, as company. And one day they got a little bit bored and they twisted her head round so that she was looking back down at her bum. Because it's not the kind of relationship you can rely on. On the other hand, this is the point at which you'll kind of go, I'm going to tell you a wonderful story. And she goes to Bury St Edmunds. She ends up in Bury St Edmunds, but in completely the wrong way. Agnes, however, is lying around in the bed with her parents, deeply worried about her, when a venerable old man comes in and says, I know all about your daughter. She is a favourite of the elves and the saints, who apparently in this part of Suffolk are indistinguishable from each other. And you think she's in trouble, but she is going to get better. And when she grows up, she's going to marry a local guy, and they're going to have a marvellous daughter who knows all the things that are going to happen. And behold, this came to pass, because Agnes had a daughter, Marian, who was even more skilled at magic than she was. And the two of them went into work together as a syndicate, finding treasure in Suffolk. To such an extent that when they needed a consecrated holly branch, they turned up one Palm Sunday and asked the local curate if he didn't mind blessing a holly branch as well as all the little palms and things, because they needed it. And they pointed out it'd be lovely because they could find a golden cross and some candlesticks, and they kind of pointed to the altar. Alas, bribery does not always work. And the curate reported them to the consistory court, and they were hauled up, which is how come we know all about it. And what I love is not only, and this is like your classic witchcraft trial, isn't it? Like, set upon woman, pulled up in front of male inquisitorial board, looking at her and going, and exactly what do you think happened to you, woman? And Agnes is kind of going, well, it's all right, because, the saints and the fairies are going to take me to the Jew's house in Bury St Edmunds, and we're going to find a great treasure. And they're like kind of going, no. At which point they then say, no, that's the wrong thing to believe. You have to go and dress up in a white cloak and confess in 3 marketplaces on 3 successive Sundays. And you're kind of going, okay, you can get away with a lot more in 1410 than you could in 1610. But it fits into this whole narrative. Diane Perkins has talked about this a lot, where definitely the fairies being talked about. Interestingly, Marian, who was also interrogated about what the hell you believe in, woman, said, oh, it's the gracious fairies. So we've jumped from the Anglo-Saxon to the Norman French terminology within 1 generation. So you could actually learn how to engage with another world. And sometimes this filters through even into the texts that we've got, which are obviously biased towards, an official church position. The life of Bartholomew of Farm is brilliant, because basically Bartholomew is one of the few working class Anglo-Saxon people who ever gets to appear in our records. Normally, your low-level merchants and your farmers get to coin a few place names, and that's all we're ever going to know about them. Because Bartholomew occupied the Farne Islands, site of St Cuthbert's former hermitage, he made his way up the grade where people actually took notice of him, came over, said, oh, excuse me, sir, we are actually writing some notes on you. I mean, he obviously recognises by then they're kind of going, well, when he's dead, he's going to make some relics. I mean, relics are no good without a story. What did you say your interesting life history was, Bartholomew? So Bartholomew says to him, well, I wasn't a holy one as a lad. I used to go out mostly doing the North Sea. I spent a lot of time in Norway, which was where I met a mate who showed me how to see demons. And they're like, what? No, it's this bloke I met, and he said, all you have to do is, you put your foot on top of his foot, and you put your hand on top of his hand, and then you get to see the demon. He was about to introduce me, and I said, I don't feel comfortable with this. But something had gone into his mind there, and after that he came back and he became a priest. So he's almost like hesitating, should I be a magician or a priest? Tossed a coin. And when he's a priest, he eventually becomes a hermit, and when he is a hermit, the things that he would have been managing as a magician come back to haunt him, because they're pretty pissed off, of course. So he's sitting there, and again, he is sitting there on a low-fat diet in the middle of an area of the Farne Islands notable for its exposure. This is a guy who is actually suffering sensory and physical deprivation, which may or may not be why he starts seeing little men on goats. They're riding round and round, whether on sea or land is never made entirely clear. Scruffy little dwarfs with long, fuzzy beards shaking spears at him. And you're kind of going, I don't remember that in the lives of the fathers. And he says, well, of course, it was a bit of a problem, wasn't it? So what I did is I got some straw, and you remember in later magical traditions, straw is a defensive against the other world. You lay a straw across and the ghost or whatever can't walk over it. And I made a whole load of little crosses and made a fence out of them. They couldn't get at the hermitage any longer, and I could get some sleep, which he continued to do, except when there was a poltergeist. But, you have to be tempted, otherwise you're not a saint. So Bartholomew is one of our ambiguous characters. And of course, the things that he's presenting us with have more than a hint of the imagery, again, probably managed by clerics, but by cultural clerics who are skilled in both the world of prayer and of charming, in the admittedly rare but significant Anglo-Saxon verse charms. In the middle of these basically herbal and prayer books, you suddenly get loud were they loud when they rode over the barrow. The enemies, who may be, it says, it's an odd charm, it's compounded out of all sorts of stuff. They may be elves, they may be hags, whatever a hag is. It's not a woman, I think, it's a spirit. They may be the Asir, they may actually be the old deities still trying to break into human civilization. Whatever it is, they're throwing missiles at you, just like Bartholomew's enemies, and obviously tiny ones, because the repeated refrain in the charm is ut little gar ifinen du bist, out little spear. Of course, because the spear is invisible. It's that small, it gets into you. It can only be removed by magic, but it must be thrown by a little person. Although it is conventional to kind of go, the fairies as little, is a way of expressing things that was put together in the Romantic period. It's more that became your sole option. Small fairies can play with children. Fairies that can come out of a hole in the ground. There's another hermit. The Life, brilliantly, because it is written in slightly demanding Latin, has just been translated in one of those wonderful Oxford bilingual editions. Godrich of Finkel. And Godrich is tough as hell. I mean, this is a guy who moved into a wood near Durham and used to lie down on the rocks, and the adders used to come and sleep on his body because he was the only warm thing for about a mile in either way. By the time we get to hear about him, he is, one gathers, in his 70s, 80s. He is well old for a medieval person. And of course, the monks of Durham Abbey are coming over and are basically acting as carers, tucking up his pillows a little bit, and then I'll ask him, but he's telling them all of his visions. And he's this lovely guy. He only speaks English, which for a monk is unusual. The monks are actually normally chattering to each other in Norman French or Latin. Godrich actually has more of both languages than he lets on, because he miraculously, unquote, is able to make things that suggest he's picking up on the conversation. Not a fool. And yet a very holy man. You can see that. And a man with this immensely visual imagination. Every time he describes what he sees, it's not just like, oh, and then I had a vision. It's over there, to the left of the altar, then going up over there. He sees it in 3 dimensions in front of him. And that is something that interests me, because in a lot of these accounts, you've got mixed sensory modes. Mutinus had a dream. Godrich clearly sees this stuff imposed on the world in waking consciousness, not in a trance, which is very rare in any kind of medieval report of the other world. And he's perfectly happy, and talks about it, of course, as a good hermit should, about times that he was tempted and nearly fell, like the little goldsmiths, who were 1.5 feet high, and came out of a hole in his cell and were black and sat there kind of, making little decorations. And then they went and buried it. And of course, Godrich is tempted. It's like, well, if I dig it up, I can kind of, go and sell it for the benefit of the poor. So he does all his own digging, and he is a self-supporting hermit. So he goes out, digs it all up, and there's little laughter around him, and then they throw puffballs at him. Now, I think this is brilliant. And it's one of the, again, so much of medieval life. If you were there, you'd see it on your first day in the village. If you're reading the texts, you're lost. I realised that puffballs are actually medieval stink bombs. They decay, you can throw them at people, you're out in the countryside a lot, so you get to know where everything is, and it's a kid's thing. So the pygmies are actually behaving childishly towards him. It is other visions, where it is imposing sights or unnatural sights, go to exactly the opposite extreme. There are 4 men, and of course lots of people wander in and out of his little oratory. So 4 men there, and he's kind of going, oh yeah, and they all reach over and they bow to him very gracefully, and he is puffed up with the sin of pride because, oh yeah, they've recognized me as a holy man. Hang on. And he looks at them with open eyes, and suddenly they go up and they knock their heads against the ceiling and stretch out like India rubber, and they're sort of smirking at him and being demonic. They're taller than they should be. Everything in Godrich that actually has an active role suddenly swells to a great size. Before the famine in the north, he was out there turning the vegetable over a bit, and he looks up, and there is this figure, he kind of goes, oh, hi mate, and there's something wrong, and the figure just strides up to the edge of the vegetable patch, swells to half a man's size, opens its mouth bigger than anybody could open a mouth, and shouts, mate, mate, mate. Triple repetition is always dodgy in these stories. It is a sign of the supernatural. I didn't figure this until I was kind of actually starting to tell it. I went, hang on, always the things they say. This is the spirit of famine. And either it's actually mimicking the people who are going to be dying, shouting, food, give us food, we want food. Or even more horribly, it is actually spiritually consuming the good of the food, taking it out of the crops, so that the wheat will be withering in the ear and will be no good to man's sustenance, which, of course, is what we'll be hearing later on in the 17th century fairy tradition about stealing the poison of food. So many of these stories just flag up for a brief passing moment, one little detail, and I can't go, hang on, I recognise that, and then it's gone, because I'm just getting through sources, which, of course, are trying to do other things, are trying to tell me about miracles, are trying to tell me about hermits. They won't actually give me what I need. And yet, when I find somebody walking down the road late at night and a black dog comes up to him with a chain jangling around its neck, I'm at once, oh, yeah, it's a black dog. It's the only one I can find. It's in the Byland ghost narratives. Wonderful sequence. M.R. James translated them, so they come with a kind of imprimatur as ghost stories. From Yorkshire, from a very small area of Yorkshire, a lot of them you can actually basically follow them on Google Earth. The guy who's making his way along on the way back home from market, and he comes to the bridge and like, oh, I can find that bridge. And he hears the sound, as it were, of ducks washing themselves in the water. Now, I rest my case. That is not made up by a medieval cleric. That is what the guy actually said. Then it starts to get a little bit spookier for him, because the hills are on his left. He hears a cry, like somebody shouting, up on the mountain. Oh, yeah. He makes his way on a little bit further, and he hears the cry again. And this time it's actually down on the heath. It's not far away from him. And he starts saying, oh, shit. And then for the 3rd time, it's coming straight at him from the crossroads ahead of him. And that triple cry lodged in a M.R. Jamesian manner in my memory, until I found it in the Reverend Jones's account of Welsh ghosts in the 18th century, and finally nailed it down in Alistair Alpine MacGregor's Stories of Highland Superstitions. Is it a motif? Is it something that the supernatural does? It is not my job to determine between these 2 options, but you do get this currency. And what you also get, I realised increasingly, is an indeterminacy which is there in the sources between identifications. Clearly, in Latin, anything is a demon if it's identified at all. What interested me is how very rarely they actually bothered to identify it. In the vernacular, in the second half of the book, is taken up with a tussle to try to extract vernacular knowledge about these beings. There is a raft, I counted about 20 in medieval sources, and that isn't including things like the word fairy itself, which only appear in the place name record post-medieval. And at first, of course, I bounced into here with a happy expression, kind of going, this is going to solve all of my problems. You know, I'm going to find one kind of place which is associated with the puka. I'm going to find one kind of place which is associated with the thus. Here will be the shinna, here will be the shuka, there will be the skursi. Like hell. All of them totally muddled up with each other. The only thing I found, which I still haven't quite got, is that there was a completely different naming tradition in Anglo-Saxon England than there was from Danelaw England. And you could follow the boundary line between the two dialects and see that something had changed. In Sussex, we are in the heart of puka territory. More names, and this, of course, evolves to Puck, and then drops out of the record, because all of these names are now unknown. Puck continued in Warwickshire until the early 18th, 19th century. Thus continued in the compound form Hobthrust and exists only in the slightly confused Hob of the Hurst. So all of these have been knocked out by other traditions. One or two of them, there are quite a few dwarfs which interested me, but of course dwarfs were forgotten and reintroduced. So there, the traditions have been re-imported from Scandinavia, and clearly a lot of the traditions also were intelligible from a Scandinavian point of view, so I could actually cheat and go over and see what was happening in Norway and Sweden. But none of this actually told me that there was one sort of creature and then another. Instead, what I got is there were pits. Everything loved to hang out in the pits. You had the whole range, elves as well. You had got associated legends with meadows. You had got stories with hills. There was kind of a cluster of stories that belonged to each landscape time. And I realized, of course, that these names, these words, were not being used as labels. Instead, they were used as general intimations of the spooky. And so I returned to my Latin as evidence, realizing that I'd been down the wrong line. I was not going to extract a fairy tradition from this. What I was going to do is I was going to get the way that people related to the supernatural. Of course, the first thing people needed to understand was, is it a nice little lad there? There's a mum who's kind of doing her business, and a little boy. It says a little red boy, but there's an ambiguity, of course, always in the medieval. Is he in fact suspiciously red, or is he just a redhead? Whatever he is, he's pestering her. Will you stop bothering? I want to talk to you. I want to talk to your husband. Well, come on back when he's home. And she kind of goes, oh, when he's back, it's darling, irritating little red lantern. Really? Make my bed in a separate chamber tonight, for I need to be ready. So, fortunately, this being, timber-framed housing, there is a large crack in the wooden walls. So, although he has been placed down there, in a chamber to which he has carefully taken all of his money bags, which he has accumulated after a long life of dubious practice, the family are peeking and going and seeing him and the little red boy, who suddenly now seems to be a lot older, dividing everything up. This one's for me, that one's for you, this one's for me, that one's for you, this one's for me. You are for me. And the wall breaks apart and the red lad takes him away. See the homilies of John of Bromyard, if not believing yours truly. Lovely guy, John of Bromyard, wrote this whole preacher's manual. And halfway through, the stories are embedded, as usual in these exemplar collections, in an awful lot of slightly tiresome mechanical theology. But then at the halfway through, he's got the bit where he kind of goes, and you should not believe as the ladies do in my home area. And you look him up, obviously, he's from Herefordshire, Shropshire, who say that they go with the good people, the beautiful people, pulcher populus, which is, unexpected Latin. Why the alliteration? And then you realise, oh my God, go with the fair folks. He's just rendering that into Latin. Go with the tall with teg. And they say that they are taken with them on strange journeys to far places. And that sometimes these people beat them. It's like Agnes and Marion all over again. They're those who can heal, can hurt, and will. And I say to them, but this is not true. You are deceived by the delusions of demons. Have you not read the Canon Episcopi, woman? And they kind of go, no, we don't accept any of this fancy rubbish about demons and stuff. Our friends are the pure people, the good people. So you've got these stories in which harm emerges. And of course, because of the structuring we've got, is cured at the saint's shrine. There must have been loads and loads of stories about which people who were beaten up by a saint, which happened quite frequently, and which is actually in the theology. I mean, some of the 16th century, 15th, 16th century mystics are actually told by Christ as an abusive partner, darling, if I didn't love you so much, I wouldn't be inflicting so much suffering on you, which of course is deeply spiritually meaningful. But the genders work out about 50-50. William Wyndham is a young chap in the repertoire of the Northern Earls, the Greystokes. So we're up in Cumbria at the moment. And he's riding through, presumably the Barley, if we're in Cumberland. And he looks out and looks it, the way you do, you know, when the wind that shakes the barley is, you know, that's nice. And this fascinates me again. It's like the ducks squatting in the pool. Nobody would have thought this up. It's a typical moment that you get from a lot of recent material when ufologists are full of this thing, the Oz factor. Like driving late at night, of course, he's riding. When you have sensory deprivation and something just seems to kind of hypnotize you. Because as he's kind of going, so nice, the wheat's coming on beautifully, look at the way it's shaking. A little red man, again, Rubus in this time, makes his way from out the barley, comes up to him, grabs his horse by the bridle. And this is like medieval mugging. He can't do anything. And the little red man, who appears to have got a little bit larger if he can reach up to a horse's bridle all of a sudden, leads the horse through the fields. You've got to imagine medieval open fields, so you're up and down a ridge and you're soon out of sight of the road, into a clearing where a beautiful lady is sitting surrounded by her maidens. The lady looks up, and maidens take young William off his horse and, you know, take his overcoat off him, then take his clothes off and take off his skin. And it is at that point that they lead him up to the lady, who splits his head open nicely and removes his brain and takes it out and puts it to one side, puts him back together again, dresses him up again, puts him back on the horse and lets him go off. So says William in his subsequent career, and who are we to doubt him? So he is then riding his way back through the fields, totally mad, literally amens, without a mind. And of course, you know, nobody by that stage gives a damn about him. I mean, he was only a bachelor knight. He was obviously pretty low in the pecking order. You know, he's a nutter, let him go. The only one who looks after him was a girl who'd been a bit soft on him when he was in the Greystoke household. And she, bless her, cleaves to him through thick and thin, takes him around, leads him to, and this is interesting, very medieval, a whole series of shrines. So, you know, it's a bit like I tried every doctor in town. He goes to one saint after another, and finally they end up in the East Riding, where, you know, absolutely knackered and feeling, well, at least they can get to sit down and, you know, have a rest. They make their way into Beverley Minster and lay down before the shrine of St. John of Beverley. And there, in the cool of the evening, he goes to sleep, and in his sleep, the lady comes to him and puts his head, you know, opens his head up neatly again, pops the brain back in again, closes it, and departs. And it's interesting that it's the lady who comes back. It is not St. John. So again, there are overlapping saintly and fairy, or, you know, demon, undesirable company narratives. And when he comes to, perfectly sane. And he tells the girl everything. And it's like, you know, all these years, the only person I could see was a little red man who kept on fidgeting with my chains. All these medieval madmen are chained up. It's like a bog standard thing. You know, when you were mad, you knew what to do. As soon as you felt your grasp on reality was, you know, slipping a little bit. There's even a case somewhere where somebody who, obviously his mother has got problems, he is taking her to a shrine, she runs away, and when he finds her in the field, she's trying to eat a stone. And you're kind of going, gosh, she's got problems. And you're going, hang on, that's the picture in Dixit Incipiens. The opening of the psalm, the one that says, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, always shows a fool gnawing on a stone to show that he's a fool, which is quite difficult otherwise to do in medieval art. So, like, again, is this just like what she knows she ought to do? Is this, you know, biased reportage? People are acting mad, and then they can stop acting mad. In some respects, some of the people, you know, because I've got people like Mutinus, or, you know, like the girl, who lose their senses, lose their power of movement for decades, and yet one day the saint comes to them and they bounce up again as well as they ever were. The only way I can relate to some of this material is to say, I'm dealing with people who have externalized their mental states into physical disability and who, at the turning of the narrative, will eventually wake up one morning and kind of go, I've left that behind me. It's a miracle. Having said that, I've got other people whose encounters with the otherworldly realm quite clearly, at least seem to me, to be the rendition of medically recognizable disease in terms of the fairy touch. In Winchester, this is one of our earliest ones, it's in Lanfrid's collections of the Miracles of St. Swithin. So 10th century, Swithin has only just, in fact, been translated, been removed from his external tomb and given the honours of a saint. And of course, the text is almost a parchment counterpart of the gold on the shrine and the sung psalms. All of these are part of how you know a saint is a saint. There's a whole string of these, give you a very good insight into life in late Saxon Winchester. And we're not marginal here. We are at the nearest thing that England has to a capital. And yet, there is a citizen of Winchester. Citizen is interesting because later on in the story we'll find him leaning on a spear. This is clearly a guy of some social standing, but of course compared to a monk, he's a layman. So he goes out to have a look at his pack horses who are grazing down by the River Itchen. It's June, it may even be dangerously close to June the 21st if I've read my medieval dating right. Midsummer is not a kind of year when you really ought to be wandering around without taking precautions. It's the middle of the day, we've had this before, and he is overcome by drowsiness. And he thinks a little bit of a nod off in the fields won't do me any harm. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, 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 dear. Because when he wakes up, he's feeling well refreshed and decides to make his way back along walking by the river, and there, sitting on the riverbank, he sees two ragged black ladies. They were like furies or possibly Ethiopians, says Lanfrid, who has read quite a lot of literature, which gives him some interesting adjectives which were probably not used by the man himself. Interestingly, later on, searching for an adjective, Lanfrid describes them as corvini, crow-like, which I think is probably much closer to the language the guy himself would have been using. Anyway, they are not at all pleasant. And in their ragged, half-naked, but it fascinates me because one of the people writing this story up kind of goes, well, that means they're seductive. No, it doesn't, not in the 10th century. In the 10th century, the more clothes you put on, the sexier you were. See in any illustration of the Whore of Babylon in Beatus's commentary of the Apocalypse, if not believing yours truly. The nakedness is scary. On the other hand, the ladies quite clearly think it isn't scary because they address him with the apparently Saxon version of "How about it, big boy?" And, nervously feeling this is not an encounter which is going at all well, he makes his way away from the river and up towards the road, which he knows, of course, will take him back up into Winchester. Not so fast, little human, because stepping out from a nearby mound, I like this. It's a mound, not a hill, but it's obviously got to be big enough to hide somebody. And a lady of towering stature, even bigger than the Black Crow-like ladies, beautiful and dressed in white garments. So, bad cop, good cop. He smiles and says to the other two, leave him alone. You don't know how to handle this. I will take care of this one. And she reaches out, and he's just out of range, and obviously not coming any closer within it. And she's wearing, those long, dangly sleeves that you see in 10th, 11th century art, ties one up and waves it at him, clearly intending to hit him. What would have happened then, we don't know, because she just misses. The waft of the air from her sleeve touches him on the side, and suddenly half of his body freezes. And he can't speak. And he can't move half his body, and he falls down. And then slowly, realizing they've gone, he grabs his spear, props himself up on it, gets up on one leg, and limps all the way into Winchester. Now you're thinking, hang on, loss of language, gradual recovery subsequently, hemiplegial loss of motor abilities. The guy's had a stroke. What is a stroke if it is not being touched by the fairy? And in fact, again, this is something that you will be finding an awful lot in things like the 19th century Irish evidence collected by Yeats and Lady Wilde. Diseases are articulated as being from, and literally the fairy touch. Agnes Hancock of Somerset, another of our fairy healers who was hoiked up in front of the bishop, who said, Agnes, what you been up to? He said, that's all right. I just cure the little children, the ones who have been tactos vel lysos, touched or harmed, which are obviously like the same thing as far as she's concerned, by the fairy. And I take off their clothes and I wash them and I do this little charm. And he's like, would you like to recite the charm, Agnes? It's in good Somerset, which he can't understand because he's a member of the working upper classes. So he tells her not to be so presumptive and to stick to Latin and to do what the priest tells her in future. And again, essentially, go off and stop bothering me, you stupid woman. They had other things to worry about in the Middle Ages. It is interesting that magical activity on the part of the working classes was obviously a pretty low priority as far as they're concerned, which is brilliant from the point of view of Agnes and Marion, who don't get burnt, but very infuriating from our point of view because you don't have anything like the 17th century evidence as to what is going on as a magical practice. So you've got these people. You've even got, just once, again, you see what I mean about these little, glimpses. I'm kind of going, oh, dearie me, it's just like the Irish material. I wonder if we'll be having a whirlwind any minute soon. And suddenly, in the Miracles of St. Hugh of Lincoln, as recorded by Gerald of Wales, who's, himself a man with a good fairy story or two to tell, there's just a woman who's making her way back home when she is picked up by a whirlwind and dumped at a crossroads, falls down and loses her ability to walk again. The Gishi, as the Irish would have it. The fairy wind that takes away your senses. So you begin to realize, what are the signs? Redness. Well, it's interesting that it doesn't have to be red. We have green. You expect green to be a fairy colour, I suppose, don't you? There is one narrative, the Green Riders in the Miracles of actually St. Cuthbert at Farn. This is a case where Bartholomew of Farn is doing the healing. He takes care of a boy who just can't do anything except kind of, mouth Cuthbert, in honour of the saint. And he's carried to Bartholomew as the expert in the cult of Cuthbert, who eventually elicits this story from him, that he was out one morning, early morning is a bad time. Noon is, we've had this, noon is a bad time. Don't ask about midnight. Early morning and twilight. I'm fascinated because midnight gets a bit of a look in. And I'm kind of going, yes, give me some midnight ghosts. There is one brilliant one in the exemplar. But by and large, of course, most medieval people are not awake at midnight. The only examples I could find was a bunch of knights were in what essentially seems to be a haunted house. But of course, again, with this overlap, poltergeists are fairies. Poltergeists are not ghosts. Because they are woken up in media nocte. So, all they know is they're woken up after they're sound asleep by the noise of a hideous racket going on overhead. And they essentially, realising that this is not a mere psychic agency, but a conscious being, shout, lay off, will you, to Robinettus, who, under whose name I noticed Little Robin, which sounds uncommonly like Hob, which sounds uncommonly like the Hob thrust that we were looking at earlier. And interestingly, again, although it's coming to me in Latin, I can see it's being delivered from English, because what Robin says, when taken back out of its attempted translation, is clearly something like on the "I shall be stiller now, that I may shriller the mara." I'm going to keep quiet now so I can make more of a racket later on. And the knights give up and go to sleep. And I know that these back translations are not just me playing silly buggers with the Latin, because the other version, which we get twice over, once in a southern English version about a goblin, and in a northern version, at any rate, written by Master Ripon. So I suspect we've moved over here about the demon which in English is called Thus. So the Thus, which of course, as in our Ogre and Woodlouse article, began as something describing Grendel, has sort of dwindled down to the fairy who grinds at the mill and who is presented, as per the international tale type, with a suit of clothes. And then, interestingly, Master Ripon, who was writing in English, quotes the words of said fairy as, "Shall such a proud gromer green de corn," which is alliterative verse. In Southern English, it's given in Latin, and I looked at that and went, and hang on, now have a coat and hood, never more shall I do good, which is the rhyme that is given in all the 16th, 17th century versions to the Hob. Eventually what happens, you see, is they've knocked the thrust half off Hob's thrust because nobody understands it any longer, and they're left with Hob, Little Robin, which has made its way into being a name. I was actually going to collect all the Hobbs, and then I discovered Middle England was full of blokes called Hob, many of whom owned pits and wells and meres, and Simon Young is very cross with me. He says I should have collected all of them as well. There's a whole appendix of fairy place names for people who want to find out the other ones. Okay, so the Thus, who does domestic labour, and who is obviously like littleish, certainly in all of the later versions, he's made a little suit of clothes, so he's moved into the small end of the spectrum. And yet in Godrich's accounts of his experiences, you've got tall, dominating demonic figures who are also working for him. He's out there, breaks off doing the gardening, and then somebody, all he says is that he was tall and strong and smelt horribly, which sounds like a kind of 12th century Durham rustic to me, moved in and started digging, and he's politely kind of going, I'll go in and do a little bit of praying now. And when he came out again, he had dug more in an afternoon than a man could dig in a week. And I'm going, that is such the Hob story. Even in Milton, in one shadowy night, has threshed more corn than the 100-day labourers could have ended. So the concept of human deficiency is also presented there. You've got this entire fairy spectrum. You've got the beautiful ladies, like the one who entertains William of Wickham, like the beautiful white lady in the Winchester story. You have got the demonic beings. You have got even what is otherwise a Scandinavian motif, never grounded itself in England. Another of Godrich's weird encounters is when, again, he assumes he's talking to a visitor. The visitor is like, bit like a shambling beggar, but obviously by this stage Godrich is redistributing charity. So Godrich gets a little bit suspicious and says, again, it's a bloody language problem. He says, pro caritate in the Latin. I think what he's saying is for God as Lufa, in an Old English dative, because this is still like a traditional area. Because what happens is that the thing cannot say it properly. It can't do the inflection. It says loof, loof, thereby anticipating early modern English grammar, but that's a demonic thing. And he kind of going, well, I'm not going to give you anything if you can't ask for it properly. And it stinks horribly as it turns round. It was green. Dead dodgy sign. Green like hollybark. Fascinates me that. It's almost like an embodied green man. And you know what hollybark is like. It is thin enough to be like a skin like clothing. Again, this stuff is always being written by people who've got very good acquaintance with nature. And when he turns round, his back was all hollow, like the inside of an ox skin after it's been cut up for meat. And it farts. They all fart in the end. It's like typical demonic thing. If it's not farting, it's sulphur or puffballs. But the hollow back, which we've lost as a kind of motif, survives, typically in the Hulderfolk in Scandinavia, as a sign that we're dealing with supernatural beings. That's how you can tell. In the same way that we've lost the triple repetition to such an extent that, again, the thing with no back says ha, 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 because he's a northerner and he's still preserved his terminal consonants. Further south in Yorkshire, the beings which went their way round the circle, which was drawn by Snowball the Tabler of Ambleside in a weird and very, very lengthy series of encounters with something which kept insisting that it was the spirit of a dead man, and needed his prayers to get it out of purgatory, but which also kept on turning into a billy goat and a black dog and a man with fire burning inside it, and occasionally into a rotating haystack with a light in the middle. All of which does tend to suggest to me that it, at least by hanging out with otherworldly beings, picked up some of their habits. This is, in those days, you were what you had company with, and once you crossed over to the further side, all of the natures of supernatural beings overlap. Because when this appears, he is prudently drawing a circle round himself because he thinks that he could do with a bit of protection. He also carries a lot of charms with him, which I absolutely love, because not very far from Ambleside, about 15 miles away, they were repairing a medieval candlestick. Down bells. And out from inside the candlestick fell a charm. Conjuro vos, O elfes, I conjure you, O elves. And it goes on and on and on with a huge number of sacred names. And it is a whole, these things are found verbally more or less identical throughout large areas of Northern Europe. So you needed what protections you could get. One of my people from Dunfermline is actually carrying a little charm tied around his neck. And again, for all I know, all medieval kids ran around with their mum carefully kind of tying a little charm around there, like you do with Japanese kids, you know. You can go out and play, darling, once you put your charm on. And they rough him up and they take his charm away from him. They throw it into a bramble patch. And he's like, scared. And they start throwing stones at him. So notice this whole kind of big kids thing. And he runs back home to his mum, but when he falls over the threshold, he's dumb, and he stays that way for 10 years. That's how they knew how the story ended. That's how they knew it was supernatural. But my goat at Ampleforth is also going round and round going, ah, ah, ah. I thought, hang on, that's the merry jests of Robin Goodfellow, who inevitably ends up, after playing his pranks on people, by laughing, ho, ho, ho. And yeah, you see, you know, the demonic origins of Father Christmas are becoming more obvious by the minute. We've lost that sense. And yet, interestingly, it still survives in Icelandic storytelling, where any creature which repeats itself twice, again, so, you know, you're listening to this kind of going, oh, that's interesting. And, you know, all your Icelandic friends kind of go, wow, that's well scary. You have to be primed with these things. So there are storytelling conventions. Although, of course, my less folkloristic version is that if there are conventions, then they're equally known on both sides of the fence. And before they start going haunting, all of these creatures know exactly what is going to freak us out in the first place. There is a serious danger that I may carry on for the next 3 hours. And I have been advised that it might be a little bit more interactive if I threw some of this open to the floor.
Yes, is there any questions? You want to find out where that noise comes from, stop it. But
It's a folk noise. You're not going to get away with it.
Sorry, I just want to make it right down. One thing, you mentioned really briefly the interaction between sort of landscape
Yeah.
and kind of landscape and different kinds of things that are observed.
Yes.
Do you see, like, I don't know, in areas where there's, I don't know, kind of history of ancient woodland versus pastures versus moorland, do you see different things being reported? Can you sort of track what was there by what those stories are?
The stories tailor themselves to water more than they do to anything else. And I was pursuing a line of thought, based apart from anything else on the kind of the choice of words. One of the Ampleforth stories is absolutely brilliant. It doesn't relate at all for this time to an intangible supernatural being. It relates to a walking body. Ghosts in the Norse, high medieval tradition, 12th to 15th, are people who actually come out of their grave. And can be wrestled with. You can stick something into them or push them back if they're trying to get over the church wall or something. So that's a construction of the dead, or a construction of them. And this is the rector, Tankerley, who I did try to hunt him down in the vicar lists, but he appears to have escaped attention from anybody. Quite clearly he was an absentee rector in the first place, which was bad news anyway, and got out of his grave at night and went to see his mistress. Loads of these stories, you know, have a dubious relationship with the priest's partner, which kind of interests me because, again, behind, you know, the irritable way in which the stories are told, there is also quite clearly, certainly early medieval, and really up to 13th century, a sense in which actually in the vernacular narratives, it's just, oh yeah, there's a village where she has just had a baby, she hasn't been churched yet. Clearly there's again, you're not told, but you figure out there's a taboo thing. You can't actually even step out of your house. You've got to stay behind the threshold until you've been properly churched and processed. So she's sitting, but there's a fair on, ho-ho. And she's like standing there kind of go, oh, at least here I can hear all the fun that's going on, isn't it? No, and her husband, as she thinks, comes in and goes, darling, it's like, so nice to see you're getting better. Come on back into the bedroom, we'll pick up again. And there, in that midday hour, he ravished her 7 times so that she passed out. And when she sort of, hobbles her way towards the door again, the fair by now is closing down, it's close of the evening, and again, the husband comes home, And he says, well, darling, you know, how you been? How you been? She says, 7 times. You bloody notice. So what? I say, oh, be more careful. Could have put a bit of straw across the threshold. And she dies horribly. I'm terribly sorry about that. But, you know, it's otherwise we wouldn't have the story in the Chronicle of Lanercost, which is being written by friars who have this particular angle on things. But it's coming from Amelia, which is obviously regarded as perfectly normal that, you know, the vicar's wife will be sitting there watching the fun going on. It's just that she was insufficiently careful about the supernatural world. So, sorry, I digress, surprisingly. You've got these narratives then, like Tankerley, who goes to see his partner, mistress, whatever, goes up to her, returning from the other world, and blows into her eye and blinds her. At which point you're kind of going, woo! Anybody who remembers the fairy midwife stories will recall that the close of that is always the fairy man going up to the midwife, who has had a close relationship with them, doing the necessary work, who injudiciously says, how are things doing over there? And he like, which eye can you see me with? And blows on the eye and blinds it. But also there are a number of stories in the exemplar, because the sermon stories, which I haven't profited from so much, because they've been more through a clerical filter. They've got no local place most of the time. They're telling more orthodox morals. But every now and then you find things about the bad things that demons do. And there are stories about demons blowing on people and putting their eyes out. So this is clearly a cross-border thing. But to get rid of Tankerley, who obviously was physically had to be got rid of. This is not like exorcism as in waving a bit of holy water around and hoping something goes away. This is picking up Mr. Tankerley, saying, come along with me, sir, please, tying him up in a bit of deer hide, sewing him in so he can't wriggle, and then handing him over to, what I love is Roger Le Carter, who has a cart, strange to relate. This is the 15th century when hereditary surnames are no longer a thing. But it may actually have been that the Le Carters, you know, when asked, how did you get this name, kind of go, well, it actually was a member of our family who had a cart by way of farming, and they asked him to do this job. So Roger takes the wagon and the horses to Gormar and goes up to the edge. Gormar has its own page on Wikipedia. I mean, it's a big site for wild swimming now. It's not just a small pit. You know, it is a substantial tarn on the edge of North York Moors, and drags the cattle in, the cart almost sinking in the mud, and finally succeeds in tipping the body out into this. And I'm like kind of going, okay, so people are putting the supernatural into water. What if it comes back again? It is surprising how many thursmeres there are. Old English mera and Old Norse mur ought to be distinct. Moor should have more of a meaning of swamp, and mera should have more of a meaning of pool. But it is noticeable that areas like East Anglia, and certainly like heading up into the Danelaw, clearly there's been a bit of a fusion, because Gormar, which is definitely a moor, is deep water. So the supernatural is put into this water. And of course you're thinking of Grendel and the haunted mere all over again, and it comes out again. Pits I love because, you know, looking at the functionality of a pit, obviously, you know, you dug a hole in something. A pit mostly, unless it's actually working, stone pit is used occasionally, but normally things like Crundle. By and large, a pit is an abandoned working where something used to happen. And on the very few of them I was able to narrow down and look at on the map, there are quite a few of these supernatural place names on Anglo-Saxon boundary charters. Because the great thing about boundary is it actually gives you basically a 6-figure grid reference. You can go and check it out. They tended to be abandoned areas. So like the typically spooky place is not always a landscape place. And also the thing I got, that this was not people's response to the wilderness, at which point a whole series of, you know, psychosocial geography dominoes went down immediately. Because lots of this stuff is happening to people like the guy in Winchester, or, you know, again, people who go out at midsummer, at Christmas, obviously like walking into the fields. And lots of this stuff, of course, is happening to kids. And I assume even with, you know, low-level medieval parenting, 5 and 6 and 10-year-olds are not being sent out long distances, especially in wolf country, which in the 12th century quite a lot of Wales and northern England was. They're looking after and the animals themselves aren't being sent out too far. They're doing all this stuff fairly near home. So it's a field. It's a field around the village. Lots of place names are either compounded with elements like croft or fold or acker. So you get elements that are of the open fields, furlang. Open field is weird because, I mean, William had his experience, obviously, in open field. But open field is normally full of people. Again, there's a sense that if you go somewhere where people are not, people are terrified of solitude. And this is what really came over to me. Even in towns, terrified of being out of home. The other thing which you don't realise, again, if you were there, you'd realise it your first evening, is for medieval women, the closing of the horizons. It's much, much more like, say, an Indian economy, where the ideal is to be wearing your wimple in your home. One of my miracles from the London ones of St Bartholomew in Smithfield is a girl who's just sent out to do an errand. And she goes out at dusk, and she's so terrified that she falls over and has a fit when she comes back over the doorstep, and, you know, has to be carried off and healed at the shrine. There is a sense of being away from people. And this is why the hermits are seeing all of this stuff. Because the hermits are, as we say, you know, from a folklore point of view, engaging in ostension. They are putting themselves, as they already know from everything they've ever heard since they were a kid, into supernatural country, because they've got the spiritual armour to take care of it. Pause. Yay!
What would I think your favourite either miracle or recollection, I suppose, be that you've come across in your research?
I wanted people to get an idea of what it was like. So I did highlight a couple of them right at the beginning of the book, and there was also kind of damn. This is not, you know, we are not in Kansas anymore. So one of the ones which I picked up, and this again is from the Miracles of Margaret, is Christina. Particularly interesting for me, because again, as you're reading it, and you have a kind of, tra-la-la, here's a medieval village, here's a medieval hovel. And it's like, and they are sitting out in the arbour in the pleasure gardens, and you're like, hang on, this is not a hovel. Christina is sitting out with her mum late at night, and they hear a noise down in the hollow below. So they're basically they're in, you know, it's almost like they're in the family park. And her mum, in fact, obviously is of some high-ranking status, because she says to Christina, well, it's probably some poor people, they got lost, or they're begging for food or whatever, run on down and see. And brilliantly, Christina, who we know to be approximately 15, kind of goes, I'm not doing that, I'm scared. And her mum says, you never do anything I bloody say, get down there, girl. And so she goes down into the hollow, where there are no missing poor people, but instead there is her brother, who's been dead for 6 months. And he's obviously like her younger brother, so it's like, there's a history of trauma here, which is not perhaps, as we might have said, been processed because he has come back. And it's a bit because he says, kiss me. And she says, no, you're dead, I'm alive. We can't do this. It's a long way separates you from me. And he reaches out and he grabs hold of her and punches her. And at that moment, she falls down unconscious. And of course, her mum, who's like kind of, looking, vaguely worried, and freaks out, falls unconscious. Servants, again, you're talking about, run out from the manor house, run down, pick up Christina, take her back in, look after her mum. The brilliant bit I love is about 2/3 later on, we discover that the servant who picked up Christina then fell ill, and they were uncertain about his recovery. But it's like, oh yeah, one of the servants also fell ill. Anyway, Christina is brought in, and again, these people are literate, which might not possibly be expected from a gentry family in 13th century Scotland, because Christina does go into something which sounds uncommonly like trance. She can't see what's in front of her, but she can see something else, and she's talking. And she talks about this beautiful queen, and she talks about the singing, and she talks about her little brother as well. He's there, and her father is shitting himself, and kind of going, get me the Book of Hours. They've obviously got a Book of Hours, or at any rate, a book of the services of the church, which he can read. So he is reciting from it. And he's shouting to her, join in on the creed, join in on the Lord's Prayer, and she won't. Because so much that has been written has been about the hegemonic role of the medieval church, which is something you can write about for absolutely ages, whilst not actually really engaging with the primary sources. Because when you're there, and you're actually realising what it's like for these people, he doesn't give a damn about the church. What he gives a damn about is his daughter, and he wants her back. And he knows that the only way to get her back is to latch onto the sacred words. So eventually, he pulls out the rope that he hasn't used for, disciplining the kids for years, and kind of goes, it's going to be the worst for you, girl, if you do not join in. And she then starts reciting the creed. And at that point, it all dies down, and the lady goes away. And finally, her brother goes away. Her father walks round to the foot of the bed where her brother is standing, and carries on reading out the scriptures. And then, of course, at that point, she's still ill. And they take her in, still basically semi-conscious, into Dunfermline Church, and lay her down. And the Queen Margaret comes to her and has a dialogue with them. They can't see what's happening. She can only see what's happening. She talks to the Queen, who says, get up and come to the place of your healing. She gets up off the slab they've put her down on, goes and rests next to the tomb. Being right next to where the saint is the most important thing. And then she just comes up, and again, like all of these people, suddenly comes out of it and says, God, right, okay, I'm back again now. I spoke to Margaret the Queen, and she says that she will accept my healing, provided I offer myself to God's service forever. And they go, oh, shit, she's got to go into a nunnery. Well, okay, we can afford to put her into a nunnery. And they actually put her into a Cistercian house at Elko, which also interests me, because that's where the story's coming from, remember. All of these stories being told, and you're kind of going, well, how did they know? Because they're talking about the personal experience of the healed person. Christina, quite clearly, could be brought to talk about, a bit like Bartholomew, this is how I came to be a hermit. This is how it came to be in God's house at Elko. And the Cistercians were, of all the orders, the most interested in supernatural narrative. Caesarius of Heisterbach, who does the equivalent German collection, which is full of all of this stuff, only German, but lots and lots of parallel narratives. He's got a story which is almost the same as the Winchester one. Is in a Cistercian house, Ampleforth as well. William of Newbury, although he was an Augustinian, was in close communion with the Cistercians. Ralph of Coggeshall as well. They're all, partly I think it's just because the Cistercians being a much better managed order. Each Benedictine house had its own finances and management. The Cistercians actually had Crown Chapter, and they would be sharing supernatural stories with each other, together with good farming practice and how to appoint a halfway decent manager. I know what they're doing, and also I can follow it step by step. There aren't any of these awkward gaps where I stop and ask myself, what in hell is going on? So many of the demon lover stories, I'm kind of going, there's something going on. But it's been so filtered because, this stuff is coming to me through people who have serious difficulties about any sexual relationship with anyone, let alone a supernatural young man who appears in a blaze of light in your bedroom. The only bit I loved was that he appeared and he gave her small bits of jewellery and attractive items of equipment, and I was kind of going, how much better than flowers and chocolates is that? But it gave me further insights into medieval life. You'll realise this is the other thing. The more time I spend with the supernatural, the more time I'm thinking, this is telling me stuff about people's lives as well.
Do you see a development and I would say integration of different cultures and mythologies throughout the
Yeah.
How does it evolve?
I think some of it is happening almost under its own steam. There are things like, if you're telling a story, you need a criterion motif. You need the bit that people stop and go, oh yes. So that twice, once with the Black Dog of Inglewood Forest, and once with the Portuni. God knows who the Portuni were. It's infuriating. Gervase of Tilbury tells us there were a little race of wrinkled men who used to appear by people's house sides, eating frogs that they roasted in the embers. And they were half an inch high. I'm like going, frogs, half an inch? What's happening, I think, I'm not the first person to realise this does not work, is that pygmies were traditionally described as semicubitalis, which actually kind of works with a long classical cubit. Half a cubit is like manageable, kid size. But it also becomes semipedalis, and and in Gervais it's saying, and basically as long as it's half of something, people figured out that you were talking about somebody very small. Anyway, leaving aside the technical difficulties with the frogs, what is noticeable? Firstly, they're wrinkled and elderly, so there's something in common with Bartholomew's riders, but they are also making their way through closed doors. And I'm like kind of going, there's a ghost motif. And what's happened is that we've filtered this stuff out over time. So by the time you hit the 16th century, and obviously suddenly you've got much, much more vernacular evidence, but there's much more confidence that demons do some stuff, ghosts do some stuff. Ghosts by that point have suddenly stopped being physical returning presences, and that's almost died out in tradition, and become wispy. And fairies, and Ronald Hutton wrote a brilliant article on this, The Rise of the English Fairy, actually now have their own narrative. So, mention fairies, and it's they have a queen, they live in a hill, they turn sixpences, put sixpences in your shoe if you've been good, all of the stuff that has been addressed in Catherine Briggs's report of the Elizabethan fairy literature. It's not that these motifs weren't there before, it was that they were floating around in a general sense of the spookiness. And so rather than there being like an evolution from people used to believe this, then they believe this, then they believe this, it's more sorting out the sheep from the goats. And you can see in a lot of ways that it's part of a growing sense of confidence that by the time you hit really the 16th to the 19th century, people are not at the mercy of the supernatural in the way they were before. And you need to go to other cultures to get a sense of what that was like. And again, I think it's got to have something to do with the precariousness of life. I mean, by, the last English famine was in the north in, the 1520s, compared to medieval life, compared to 1317, when people just falling over and dying in the streets. From our perspective, it was still an incredibly uncertain existence, but it did not have that elemental feeling that at any moment the bottom could drop out of your life. And there are parallels. There is a Welsh girl in one of the Northern Miracles who gets left alone at night out in the fields, obviously her parents didn't pick her up in time or whatever, climbs up into a tree and loses her mind. Just the terror of being outdoors. But who simultaneously goes on to have this long life story. And again, remember, we're hearing all of her stories from her later in life piled up on top of each other, in which she goes back to Wales, gets married, gets caught up in the Edwardian conquest, loses her husband who is killed by a passing Englishman. You're kind of going, this is turning into sort of medieval Angela's Ashes. But you've got this sense that people's sense of supernatural anxiety. And this, of course, is why the nearest modern comparanda we've got are from 19th century Connaught, from people who are something like near a medieval uncertainty of life.
I've no timepiece on me, so I just don't know what time it is.
20 to 7 according to a quick calculation. Okay.
Sorry. So to remind you what's at the front, is we've still got a £20 copy of the Devon and English Landscape, 3 copies of the Folklore Journal, the maps have gone, and the talk that the book that Jeremy's talk is based on is here at 35% discount, but it's somewhere. But yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Our next talk is on the 18th of November. It's Tom Baker's Gothic Delights, and that's me talking about Tom Baker and the Gothic, both as horror but also Gothic literature. And there's something with George MacDonald in December one, I can't remember off the top of my head, so we'll have to have that as and when. But the Twitter feed is active, the YouTube channel's got stuff on it, and there's a mailing list if you're not already on it, pop us a line and you can get added to it. And you can follow all the exciting things that we're doing at the centre. Otherwise, let's thank Jeremy again, and then let's go out into the night.